What's going on, guys? And welcome to the first Bloodborne video I've made in quite a long time on this channel. I've been watching streams and videos from other creators, and after being enamored with other games for the past while, I found myself kind of motivated to get back into hunting. It almost felt like coming home in a way, or visiting an old friend. I remember especially being pulled in by its really unique weapons, all of the different builds you could make, and most impressively, the amount of freedom the game gave you to do so. If you wanted to take a less traveled route through Canehurst and get some early bloodstone chunks and have an OP build before you even got halfway through the game, there was really nothing stopping you. Finding a weapon especially always felt like an event. It felt like I was a child finding a new toy. It felt exciting and enthralling. Some weapons had tricks up their sleeves, and their uses wouldn't always be immediately apparent. But something else I learned after years of playing Bloodborne is that there's something to be said for simplicity. The game's later weapons feature some pretty over-the-top designs, movesets, and some hidden abilities that are left for the hunters to find out for themselves. But some of the weapons you find in the earliest portions of the game surprisingly end up being the most efficient. The viability of a weapon in Bloodborne is decided by much more than just raw damage numbers. Certain weapons have different attack types, faster movesets, scale with different stats, and even have hidden damage modifiers against certain types of enemies, just to name a few examples. Most enemies that fall under the type of kin share a common weakness to bolt damage and thrusting damage, which can be taken advantage of respectively with weapons like the Tonitrus and the Rider Palash. Enemies of the beast variety are generally weak to fire, and you can take advantage of this by applying an elemental buff to your weapon with fire paper, or the use of Molotovs or the flame sprayer weapon. Each weapon has its own array of competencies and weaknesses, making the idea of there being an objectively superior weapon a little difficult to argue. Few weapons you'll find, however, excel in these criteria, like the game's flagship flesh render and main starting weapon, the Saw Cleaver. The Cleaver's surprisingly quick moveset, combined with its above-average base damage, makes it an incredibly capable weapon that prepares you decently for any threat. But there are a couple other hidden specialties the Cleaver has that make it uniquely powerful. There are two hidden damage modifiers based entirely around the game's lore that you won't really find on any item description or from any NPC. The only hint of this mechanic you ever really see is in the Saw Cleaver's description, stating that the cleaver is a symbol of the hunt and will only grow in effectiveness the more grotesquely transformed the beast. These two damage modifiers are categorized as serrated and righteous. Neither of these should be ignored. Serrated weapons tack on an additional 20% of damage to any true beast, meaning a beast that has fully transformed. Examples include enemies like the Scourge Beasts and the Man-Eater Boars you first find in Central Yharnam, and even include bosses such as Vicar Amelia and the Blood-Starved Beast. Righteous damage is a modifier seen in weapons that originated from the Healing Church, such as the Holy Blade and the untransformed Threaded Cane. These weapons deal an additional 20% damage to any foe in the game that is deemed an enemy of the Church. Examples of these enemies include the Bloodlickers and Gargoyles found in Canehurst Castle. Since a large portion of the enemies in Yharnam are beastly threats, a serrated weapon like the Saw Cleaver or the Spear will see much more application. There are also some unique weapons, like the Threaded Cane, that are capable of dealing either type of damage. In its base form, the cane deals righteous damage, while its threaded form deals serrated damage. It can be obvious what weapons have these modifiers attached to them, as some weapons are outlined with sets of teeth on the blade that quite loudly indicate the weapon is capable of serration. Other weapons, such as the Church Pick, require a little more inspection. It is a weapon that originated from the Church, meaning it gets the righteous damage modifier, but the weapon actually deals both righteous and serrated damage. evidenced by the design of the weapon taking the shape of a single serrated tooth, similar to what you find on a saw weapon. The amount of congruence you can find between a weapon's design and its function in-game is surprisingly extensive. Weapons with bloodletting teeth grew increasingly synonymous of Yharnam's hunt. They were blunt, violent, and were only more effective against more grotesquely transformed beasts. As hunts went on, weapons such as the cleaver and the spear were pioneers of the notion that, in order to clean up a mess, you had to be willing to make one. The spear exhibits many similarities to the cleaver's physical design, but there are a few reasons why I tend to prefer this weapon over the cleaver, be it starting a fresh new game with a new character, or trying your best to survive in NG+6. Despite the saw spear having lower base damage compared to its bigger and more marketable brother, the spear variant also has slightly better scaling with the skill and arcane attributes, whereas the saw cleaver only scales up noticeably with the strength attribute, giving the spear a little more potential upgradability in the late game. The spear is actually a preferred weapon for those looking for an effective arcane build. Adding arcane blood gems to any physical damage weapon automatically converts all of that weapon's damage to arcane damage. This also means this weapon will now primarily scale with your arcane stat instead of strength or skill. The saw spear is one of the most coveted weapons in arcane builds because of its massive scaling potential when used with an arcane blood gem. And understandably so, because you can get some pretty crazy numbers with this build, and it's quite easy getting overpowered pretty early on. The saw spear is also commonly chosen for its much more versatile moveset, although it does receive some slight criticism for its transformed moveset being a little on the slower side, at least when compared to the cleaver. Just as a quick refresher, physical damage comes from non-elemental weapons and includes two extra subtypes, being thrust and blunt damage. As great a weapon as it is, one of the cleaver's main drawbacks is that it exclusively deals physical damage, a drawback the spear's moveset does not suffer from. The spear is primarily a physical damage weapon, save its transformed R2 attack, which is a forward poke that, as you would expect, does thrust damage. Having a weapon capable of dealing multiple types of physical damage is incredibly handy, as it significantly extends the palette of enemies that you can counter without needing to invest resources into a second right-hand weapon. Having an attack with thrust damage means you have an extra advantage against most of the kin enemies, like the brainsuckers and the winter lanterns. As many reasons as I have for choosing the spear over the cleaver, probably the most significant advantage the spear has against the cleaver is that the serrated damage modifier is applied in both its concealed mode and its transformed mode. One thing that isn't immediately apparent of the cleaver is that the set of saw teeth are only built on one side of the blade. When the weapon is transformed and the blade rotates, you're now attacking with the cleaver edge of the blade, and the serrated damage is no longer applied. If your cleaver's transformed R1s have ever felt slightly less powerful against certain enemies, this is probably a huge reason why. The spear variant is able to take advantage of the serrated damage modifier in both of its forms, evidenced by the spear including saw teeth on both sides of the blade instead of just one, which I think is a pretty fair trade-off, considering the weapon gets criticism for its transformed moveset being so slow. I know that others have made videos on this topic before, things like build guides, weapon tips, and whatnot, and I guess there's not much reason for this video outside of me just becoming obsessed with Bloodborne again. But if you're a retired hunter that's recently picked up the game again, or if you're just a new hunter entirely that's looking for some new advice, my Discord is always open to having new friends. I'm interested to hear about other underrated weapons you guys have fallen in love with, much like I have the spear. So please come and tell me about your experience down in the comments. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk type video, I guess, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video.